we often hear people come back to us to say is, hey, you know what? It's 2026, our docs visitors are down, but we're getting more like inbound leads and demos than ever.
The behavior is changing from search and browse to query and execute. In fact, the discovery friction has reduced more in last 3 years than the previous 20 years.
When developers are talking more to documentation rather than reading it, how has developer experience reshaped?
People are going less to the documentation to implement, and they're spending a lot more time in your documentation to evaluate whether or not they should be using or buying this tool. Traditional developer experience matters a bit less, and agent experience matters increasingly more so.
Now that documentation is increasingly being accessed by AI assistants and agents inside IDs, how does that change what intent means?
We used to have this 2 weeks or 3 weeks of time. I think that time will also shrink because agents will be able to compare, build a POC in a few hours now.
What are some of the biggest mistakes you see DevTool teams make when they're trying to enable AI-driven docket support?
One of them is probably being too hesitant to lean in. A common objection we hear is
Today we're diving into a very interesting topic, how AI is reshaping developer experience. I think DevX has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. How developers learn, how they discover tools, how they troubleshoot problems, all of that has changed multiple times, sometimes gradually and sometimes very suddenly. And right now it feels like we're at another inflection point. With AI assistants, copilots, and ID native workflows becoming very common, the way developers access information seems to be evolving again. But the real question is, how deep is this change? Is it just a layer of productivity on top of what already existed? Or is it actually reshaping how developers evaluate and adopt tools? And more importantly, what it means for teams building developer tools right now. And that's exactly what we're here to unpack today. And I'm joined today by Emil Sørensen, co-founder of kapa.ai, which is building the AI interface layer between developers and a company's technical knowledge, and Gaurav Jain, CTO of Reo.Dev, which surfaces developer intent signals and helps DevTool companies identify which engineering teams need their products today. Welcome, Emil and Gaurav.
Thanks, Disha.
Perfect. Emil, let's begin with you. If you can tell us a bit about Kappa and what you're building here.
Yeah, I'd be super happy to. At Kappa, we make it easy for teams that have complex products to make them easy to use. What we essentially do is we work with very technical companies, folks like Nordic Semiconductor, Grafana, Sentry, to turn their technical knowledge bases, whether it's documentation or tacit knowledge, like the stuff that lives in GitHub issues, into AI assistants that teams can put on their documentation sites.
Very interesting. So you're essentially changing how developers are consuming this content.
Yeah, pretty much. It used to be way back in the day, books and manuals. That's moved on. At some point, it became documentation sites. They're still very much around. We went through a phase of looking at Stack Overflow. And now we're at a point where people expect to be able to ask an AI about a tool and get an answer.
Definitely. I think at each stage, the expectation of what developers want, that has changed a lot, and how they're consuming information has changed too. So really exciting stuff, Emil. And Gaurav, same question for you. For those who may not know, could you give us a quick sense of what Reo does and what problem you are trying to solve?
So Reo.Dev is a developer intent tool helping any developer-focused companies build a revenue pipeline using activities which developers are doing on their first party or third party data sets. So in a very short line, we are converting developer activity into a revenue pipeline.
So I think before we deep dive into AI specifically, would love to zoom out a bit. So Gaurav, my first question is to you. Looking back 20 to 30 years, developer experience has changed a lot. That's what we discussed. From buying books to joining IRC chats to Stack Overflow to today's documentation. What really has changed in these phases?
So I think, the overall journey for developer experience has been phenomenal. In fact, I have been in the industry for more than 17 years now. And I remember my early days when we had to write a code or, build a solution. We had to find out a book, then figure out which chapter to look in, then, turn over so many pages. And it used to take weeks and sometimes even months to get an appropriate solution to the problem which we are looking at. Obviously, forums and IRC channels helped us a lot. We were able to ask questions, but we had to wait for the answers. The Stack Overflow was a breeze where we were able to get the solutions in a few hours or maybe in a day's time. But with AI coming in, I think it has become very quick, almost instantaneous. And if I have to just, give you a one line to this, I would say a DevX evolution is more of a story of shrinking time to solution, which is what every developer really care about. Other thing which I feel which has changed is the knowledge, which has moved from being static to being more interactive and dynamic. Like in books, everything was like, whatever you can consume. But with AI, it's like, an expert sitting next to you and you can just converse. So now you are able to converse with knowledge. So that's another big change which I see. And third, I would say is the cognitive load has shifted. Earlier, devs were supposed to know where to search. Today, what they need to know is what to ask. So the behavior is changing from search and browse to what I say is query and execute. In fact, the discovery friction, in my opinion, has reduced more in last 3 years than the previous 20 years.
Interesting. I think Gaurav totally agree. And Emil, what is your perspective here? Were there moments that you felt were like inflection points where you saw a change in how developers were learning and evaluating tools?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, Gaurav, I really agree very much with your narrative here of like the time to solution shrinking. Disha, to answer your question, I think the big moment was the ChatGPT moment. Like late 2022, I think developers got their first taste of, oh, here's this new way where you can just dump in your problem and you don't have to sit and wait for some kind incident soul to answer your question on Stack Overflow. And you might actually get the solution right there. I really think that was the biggest shift. Back then, there were lots of issues. Models hallucinated a lot more, and you're relying on older training data. A lot of stuff since then has been kind of solved or closer to being solved for how developers can make use of this more interestingly. I would maybe argue that there's been one more shift that's way more recent. So it's still a bit too early to say, but arguably with like the Opus 4.6 release, I think back in November, that finally felt like it was the unlock to make some of these longer running agent systems work well. Arguably, we've entered the shift where traditional developer experience matters a bit less, and to kind of borrow the term from Netlify's CEO, agent experience matters increasingly more so.
Emil, could you elaborate a bit there? What do you mean by the Opus 6 that change that happened for people who might not know?
Yeah, of course. I think there's been this wonderful dream of having models use tools for the longest time. I think one of the earliest users of Kappa was LangChain, actually, like more than 3 years ago when Harrison was struggling in his Discord to manage like his technical support. But even back then, there was a lot of talk of using kind of React paradigms to potentially let agents call tools and so on. Frankly, it's been 2.5 years, and some smaller versions of this have worked until then, but I think it really wasn't until Claude Code and ultimately Claude Code with Opus 4.6, now increasingly Codex 5.3, that really moved the needle to a point where you can get to a point where you can just kind of let these systems run on their own. I think there's a great quote from Peter Steinberger, the OpenClaw author, on like a podcast he was on, where he essentially talks about like in the last few months, you've gotten to a point where it's still tricky, but you can learn to just let go and trust these systems to write your code. I wouldn't do this necessarily with our own Kappa full code base yet, but I've been trying this on a bunch of weekend hacks and projects, right? Like this idea of like learning to let go and just let the agents run is really fascinating. But of course, the implication here for developer experience is it means devs or hobby devs are comfortable letting go and not reviewing any of the code the models are producing. Well, no longer like do you have to cater to humans directly in your dev tool. Only if your agent comes back and asks for an API key, then you might look at a website and go, hey, is this something I trust giving an API key to my agent with? It matters all of a sudden a lot more how good your developer experience is for agents.
But no, I mean, makes sense. But, now when developers are talking more to documentation rather than reading it, and now with agents also sort of doing all of that, how has developer experience reshaped? So are we saying that the tasks which were very repetitive, wherein there were certain things that needed to be done, those are being outsourced with agents and developers are focusing on other things? How have you seen developer experience evolve in this context?
That's a good question. I mean, the extreme end is that case, I would say. It's like, hey, developers are no longer looking at their code, right? Like Boris, author of Claude Code, saying 90% of the Claude code was written using Claude Code. And like really learning to let go, in which case, I mean, then developer experience has changed massively, right? Because now all of a sudden it values a lot more your ability to hold an entire system in your head and become way more of an input giver as opposed to a reviewer. I think that's the extreme case. I know like developer Twitter loves like glorifying this nirvana that we're here today. I think if you bring it back much closer to reality, there's inklings of this that's interesting when it comes to developer experience, right? Like a much more practical approach to this is like what we're seeing is like, hey, most people do use something like Cursor, etc. today, or a variant of it. Like, hey, or Claude Code, but that stuff will still struggle to implement your framework because like web search is clunky, or like, hey, you have two versions and it's not clear which one it's supposed to pick, and so on. And there you can do a lot more practical things from a developer experience perspective, like launch MCP servers that are hooked up to all the latest like developer information you have. It's a really interesting time.
I think it's a spectrum, right? And as you said, it depends on how much you can let go.
Yeah.
Perfect. Gaurav, what is your take here if developers are increasingly interacting through AI instead of navigating documentation directly? Does it also change how evaluation is happening?
I agree with most of the things which Emil was saying, that the discovery of tools obviously have started AI layer, where you go, you ask questions, you evaluate tools there, you compare them. But what I feel being a developer is when it comes to like hardcore production stuff, you obviously want to go back to the documentation. And that's where what becomes very important is that now your docs are not just your point of entry, but they are basically part of your bottom of the funnel. And in fact, they are helping the developers build the validations which they have in their head. Docs importance is increasing, not just because machine is reading it, but it is becoming more and more integral part of the whole evaluation cycle for a developer. So that's what I feel, right?
Maybe building on that, I totally agree. Like, I think an interesting conundrum we often hear people come back to us to say is, hey, you know what? Like, it's 2026, like our docs visitors are down, but we're getting more like inbound leads and demos than ever. I think what's happening is there's a shift. Like, people are going less to the documentation to implement and troubleshoot your solution, and they're spending a lot more time on your documentation to evaluate whether or not they should be using or buying this tool. So if anything, that the kind of intent you get off uses on your documentation is arguably more important than ever.
So one of the things which I always say, ML, is the reading part of the documentation is now getting skipped. Now it is the integration part, or thinking of documentation as a core part of the infrastructure, which is what the DevTool should be thinking about, that this is not just a content or a destination, but this is an infrastructure which you are giving to agents or these LLMs, which can actually help you build more concrete production use cases, and hence the developers will eventually come in the end to basically consume it. So yeah.
Makes sense, Gaurav. So what I'm understanding is that, while earlier there would be a lot of hobbyists or people who were early in their evaluation coming to docs, now that part is getting skipped, and the people that were coming to documentation are the ones who are really serious and are actually evaluating and looking to build. So I think that's an interesting sort of shift. So Emil, my next question is to you, and I understand that, we feel that AI in dev experience is not just a productivity boost, but it's like a full paradigm shift. And in that context, is IDE become the primary interface for learning and documentation?
Ooh, that's a good question. So IDEs, so things like Cursor, VS Code, are they becoming the primary interface for documentation? I think maybe it goes back to the point we had here just before. So are IDEs becoming the primary interface for documentation? Maybe, but if so, it's for troubleshooting. It's for implementation usage. It's not for evaluation. If you're a serious company or serious enterprise, before you go and rip out Postgres and put in some sort of like scalable like alternative, you'll probably want to go through, look at the Yugabyte or Cockroach documentation, etc. But your infrastructure engineer who has to do the implementation might be spending a lot more time on or directly engaging with the documentation, using their documentation MCP server directly in an IDE. So I think it's increasingly becoming an interface. I would probably be hesitant to say the primary interface yet, but it definitely depends on the seriousness of the application. I'll give you an example. As like a total hobby dev, weekend projects, like I had my like OpenClaw instance come back and go like, hey, I'd love to use like an email inbox. Could I use like agent mail? I did not look at the docs. I just very quickly like, hey, here's an API key. Like, yeah, go do your thing, right? It's like limited on a credit card. I'm not too worried. I did not look at the docs there, but that's not a very like high risk use case. It's not ripping out Postgres.
Makes sense. Gaurav, what is your take on this? How do you see IDs evolving? And if we fast forward this 2-3 years, How different does a developer workflow look to you?
How I see it is from a very developer centric lens, right? See, what developers really care about is solving the problems fast or whatever has happened in the past, but going to 10 different tabs and searching what is there and what is not there, and then building a doc for a comparison was always time consuming. And developers never wanted to do that. Now, if they are writing code in IDE and if there is a small window where they can just ask whatever questions they want to, I think as a developer, I would love that. In fact, if you see in the last 6 months or so with Cursor and all these LLM integrations in IDE, a lot of developers have started doing that. There are two problems which I see. One is, or actually not two problems, but one major problem, which is a lot of these dev tools, like what Emil was also mentioning, right? Their documentations are not agent friendly as of today, or not these LLM friendly. I mean, it's in the process today, right? And hence these LLMs hallucinates a lot. What happens is if you are asking for a very mission critical sort of a job to these LLMs inside the IDs, they will hallucinate and they'll do things here and there, and it will just become a very complex situation for the developer to debug. So I think going forward, I would see that two things will happen. A lot of these MCP-fication of the documentation will happen, and developers, if they start integrating those MCP docs inside their IDs and start using it from there, I think that would be an amazing experience for developers. Everything happening inside ID, every code line as a context in the ID is already there, and they will be able to be more productive and able to solve more problems pretty quickly.
If fast evolution is something that we learn from, developers are moving towards things which gives them access to information faster. And, if ID is able to give them that documentation, then that seems to be where we're moving towards. Definitely makes sense. But Gaurav, I had a follow-up question here. So now that documentation is increasingly being accessed by AI assistants and agents, inside IDs, how does that change what intent means? And does it break the way DevTool companies currently measure engagement?
I would not say it will break the way, but yes, there are definitely a few changes which needs to happen. Like what Emil was talking about, agent experience. I think everybody has to be prepared for agent experience. In fact, one of the things which I was talking internally also, we need to evolve from DevGTM to agent GTM, right? Because the consumers are also going to be agent and the providers are also going to be agent. So how would that agent to agent GTM work is going to be very, very interesting. Few things which seems pretty logical, right? Agents are going to evaluate tools before humans. But I believe accountability will still lie with the developers. So at the end, they need to sign it off like, every other place, right? Second is, I feel intent signals will evolve. For that matter, I think website visits are going to be no longer important. I don't think anybody is going to go to websites in general. MCP, I personally feel MCP is going to be a big boon for developers and even for marketing team at DevTool companies. One more thing which I feel is the evaluation cycles are going to compress massively. So we used to have this 2 weeks or 3 weeks of time to capture the intent and act on it. I think that time will also shrink because agents will be able to compare, build a POC in days or not even days, in a few hours now. So I think the GTM team needs to get accustomed to all these kind of changes and build their pipeline accordingly.
Makes sense. Interesting times. And Emil, what is your take on agent to agent evaluation? Do you see us moving towards that? And then what changes do you foresee?
I'll give you kappa anecdotes. Like we constantly track the number of new opportunities or leads we get from not necessarily agents, but I guess traditional like ChatGPT and Claude stuff, if that's any sort of proxy. And that's the fastest growing channel for us right now.
It is. Okay. So what really excites, the both of you about AI-driven future of DevX, and what worries you? Emil, if we can start with you.
It's like if executed well, right, we could build so much cool stuff. I think it's just the coolest, right? Just from, again, personal perspective, someone who has to sit and think through, what do you build every single week? How do you keep pulling the product in the right direction and so on? Our linear board is endless with customer feedback, right? There's so many great things to go build that even us as a fantastic engineering team, world-class engineering team, we're just not going to have time to build. And there's a long tail of stuff that's going to impact sure, it's going to impact 3 customers, but it's not going to impact 100, but it's still a really helpful thing for those 3. We're getting a lot closer to a world where we don't have to make that prioritization, and we can still make those 3 folks happy and actually go build that. So I think that's the bull case, right? And expand that way beyond Kappa scope and Reo scope just means we can like increase global productivity by a ton. The bear case, or the thing that makes me worried, right, is we're not quite there yet. like we're still very much in like AI slop land, and if you do this without too much taste, I don't know, this is going to turn out for the worse. One of my favorite recent examples is, I think I was watching like a YC landing page teardown. One of the partners, Aaron, occasionally will do these, and they're always like, they're a hoot, they're great to watch. I think one of the things they commented on is like, well, you're looking at a website for a startup, it looks really promising and has all these like screenshots, but because it's February 2026, you don't know if the thing actually works or if it's like a vibe coded thing over the weekend. So you're at a point now where you can build something that looks great, right? But like, does it actually work? I guess that's the bear case.
What about you, Gaurav? What is your thought here?
Absolutely exciting. In fact, what seems impossible, I would not say impossible, but impossible in a time frame, is now seeming very much possible. The point I mentioned above, there is a massive reduction in time to solution today. In fact, I'm seeing more and more people becoming builders. So I would rather, change this term of developer to builder, because a developer does not just need to know the coding. They should ideally be building something. And I see even marketing folks, even finance folks are building stuff today. So that's amazing, right? The second thing which I feel is with this whole AI thing coming into the picture, it is becoming very easy to figure out multiple solutions and compare them. So at the end, the better solutions are going to win. It's not just the ones who are making a lot of noise and a lot of marketing on the website, but the better solution is what is going to win, which is a very, very good thing, at least from a developer's standpoint. I think another interesting thing is, while I think in the last 5 years, there has been a lot of push on developer experience, but with what is happening today, I think this will become much, much better. There will be more accountability on developer experience, and that is something which is going to be liked by a lot of developers. So yeah, and in fact, from a concern point of view, one of the biggest concern is, I think Emil also mentioned, is AI slops, right? I mean, a couple of days back only, I was reading a new product coming in, which is equivalent of GitHub, which is going to manage all the code which is getting committed by AI, right? There's so much of code which is getting written, and nobody knows how to manage it. So that's a big problem. Another one which I feel, and this might not happen actually, but I personally feel that products improve because of feedback coming from developers. Now, if developers are slightly away from the product and AI is doing a lot of stuff, then the whole feedback cycle will slow down. And I don't know how the product teams are going to cope up with that. But yeah, I think that's one of the concerns which I have.
I have an idea on this one. I mean, now we're really pushing into the future. But I think one of the, and I'll check my own bias here because this is Kappa related. One of the most interesting patterns we're seeing is the fact that you can essentially run analytics on what cursor is trying to call your MCP server to do. That's, for example, something we realized that we can add on in terms of value to Kappa. So for teams like, ClickHouse and like Netlify and Sentry and Grafana and like lots of these cool tools that build their MCP servers on top of Kappa, you can now go to like a Kappa dashboard and go like, hey, what are some of the top questions that these agent harnesses are essentially trying to call, like to ask their docs MCP servers for? And you can like find these really, really interesting patterns to go like, oh, wow, seems like it's really, really, really struggling to like this part of the installation journey. Maybe there's something you have to take into account from, I don't know, running this in a sandbox. So I think ensuring that you have some sort of analytics layer on top of your like MCP server so you can at least understand or begin to understand how agents are using this. I was curious, I don't mean to go off script, but I actually had a question for you, Gaurav. I'm really excited. I was genuinely wondering, I mean, you guys are dev go-to-market experts. And like, as things are changing so fast, like, are there new types of intent signals that developer tooling companies should be increasingly aware of? You mentioned the inverse, that, website traffic and traditional website visitors, that might be less interesting now. But I guess to flip it around, what are some signals that might be emerging?
So, I mean, what you really mentioned, analytics on top of the questions which they're asking. Actually, these questions are a very good intent signal for GTM teams also. For example, like, earlier when somebody is going to 20 different doc pages, we had to somehow figure out, what this guy is trying to do. But in this case, the person is coming and asking what he wants to do, or what is his use case, right? Or what is the problem they are trying to solve in the company, or where are they stuck? And in fact, one of the things which I always tell, you should not reach out to developer randomly, but you should reach out to them if they are stuck at a problem. And if you have a solution for that, they will absolutely pick up the phone. They will be ready to come on a call with you. So this queries, these conversations which are coming from AI bots and the kind of solutions, for example, Kappa provides, becomes a very good intent signal. So if you can understand those, and that is what we are also trying to do with partnership with Kappa also, right? Which is we are giving them the entire timeline of what kind of questions they asked, what was the response, what was the next question they asked, so what kind of use case they are trying to solve, and hence what opportunity is coming for the tool to basically sell to this developer. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting intent signal which we are seeing now.
What if I had a follow-up on what you had said? So you said that, now marketers, product people, everyone is coding. So do you feel that that's a threat to developer jobs? Do you see that declining?
Not really. It's one of the most hottest topic being discussed for the last 6 to 8 months. If you look at historically also, whenever something becomes easier, the jobs have always increased. If I may take a liberty of, going back like 40, 50 years, when there was assembly language, building anything was like so complex that not a lot of people were able to really do it. But from assembly language to C++, to let's say Java to Python, and then building some very high level programming language, every time the skills required to build something has reduced, the number of developers or number of builders have actually increased. Now, this is the same thing. Now you are able to build something very easily. My assumption is the number of builders will increase a lot, and I don't think the number of jobs will go down. Probably you might need to adjust on your skills, what you used to do earlier versus what you will be doing now. But I think the number will obviously increase, cannot go down.
Emil, what is your thought here? What do you feel?
If we're trending towards even developers being more comfortable letting go and letting the agents take control, what this implies for the talent pool of potential builders, it means folks that might not have grinded away for 10 years can also ship code. And I think that's really exciting. Like, I'm feeling this firsthand. Like, I've not done any engineering on the Kappa stack now for more than 2 years, and I'm a rusty engineer at that, but I've been shipping more code than ever before. Admittedly, not like core Kappa like backend service stuff, but it's very empowering knowing that you can go from idea to something shipped pretty quickly.
Just to add on to what Emil was saying, Disha, right? The art of letting go, it has to happen because, like, for example, when I was coding in Java, I never used to care what assembly language or what assembly code it was generating behind the scenes. Because at the end, everything has to be that machine language, which is what computers understand. But we evolved from assembly to Java, and we are not caring anymore what sort of snippets it is actually creating in the machine language. So same thing. These are all the level of abstractions which are getting created. And once you go higher up, you start solving higher order problems, and you assume that all the lower order problems are already taken care of.
But what then who brings in this structure? Because I think you also mentioned that the onus still lies on the developer. And while agents might do part of their work, the final check and balances is something that the developer should do. And I think, Emil, you also mentioned that, you wouldn't let an agent do the entire evaluation. You would like to keep some checks. So who sort of decides and where do you draw that line?
Interesting question. See, at the end, whoever has the accountability should draw that line. And I'm assuming that accountability will always be there. No systems will be built without accountability. There has to be somebody who is accountable for building stuff, right? So yeah, whoever is accountable will own it and will figure out whether they have to use 100% of agents or whether they have to use 10% of the agents. And they should be knowledgeable enough to decide on these.
Emil, do you have any thoughts here?
Gaurav's nating the answers to all of these questions.
Just coming back to the point wherein we were saying that documentation is evolving so much, and Gaurav, you had mentioned that, documentation needs to become more agent friendly. So Emil had a question here. If documentation becomes like an infrastructure which is powering AI rather than just like a destination for developers, how should companies rethink how they write and structure it?
That's a good question. So on this, I think you can draw a lot of parallels from the SEO geo debate that's happening now. How do you optimize everything for geo? How do you ensure that ChatGPT cites your product? I think honestly the same applies to developer experience and agent experience. And overwhelmingly the take is it's not that different. Sure, there's a bunch of tricks you can do and you have to get all the technical parts right of your page structure and all this, but most of that is table stakes anyway. From a SEO perspective, it's, hey, make sure you have relevant and interesting and high quality content that matches based on what people are searching for is up to date. You have high dwell time that people are like engaging with a page, etc., etc. Same applies to docs, right? Like I think we have like the most high rank like Hacker News front page thing for writing docs in AI we wrote like sometime last year. And like there, it's all the same thing. It's like, hey, just, ensure your documentation is well structured. So like if you land on a random page that you know where this is from a breadcrumb hierarchy level, across like the stack, make sure that sections, have good metadata associated with them. So if this only applies to a certain version, say so. Make sure that everything is self-contained and has good code snippets and all this stuff. But all of this would have applied if you had asked, a technical writer for how to write good technical documentation in a pre-LLM era as well.
Makes sense. And what are some of the biggest mistakes you see DevTool teams make when they're trying to enable AI-driven docket support?
One of them is probably being too hesitant to lean in. A common objection we hear is, hey, I don't think our documentation is AI ready. So we don't feel that we're at a point where, for example, we should add an AI search layer on top or create our own MCP because we have, half a year of content work is due to catch up. I think that's a fallacy because what happens is now you're relying on the big general models to hopefully give good answers to those questions, right? As opposed to providing your users a more direct way of actually engaging with this content. So what we usually say at this point is, well, hey, in that case, better to have something live that you own and control and know where it falls short, know where it can't answer questions, so you know what to improve against. So pushing people over that initial like bump of being maybe overly cautious still is probably the number one failure mode we see.
And do you see more and more companies now moving towards AI-enabled docs, or is there still some hesitancy?
Yeah, I think it varies a lot across industries too. If you're a new 2-person YC startup, like chances are you're going to be pretty aggressive on this stuff. Versus, we spent a bunch of time last year working with Nokia. They moved on from making tires and phones, and now they power a lot of the networking infrastructure that probably like powers my current 5G on my phone now, for example. They're massive, huge organization. Like they were really worried, are we in a good point where we can have something like this live? Of course, it's a lot more complex, like any dev tool would look at their documentation and go like, whoa, order of magnitude more like technical writers and so on. It's way more complex. But even they got to a point after they started engaging with this that like, hey, you know what? Now's the time. This stuff has passed the bar of being good enough to go live with something like this.
And Reo.Dev works with more than 150 plus DevTool companies now. Have you seen them adopting, MCP-enabled docs and using MCP gateways? And what is the change that they are seeing?
Absolutely. In fact, very fascinating data coming up, right? So there are some pretty interesting insights. Like, for example, what we have started seeing is in the core categories like database and some of the core infrastructure, we are still seeing, good documentation usage. But categories like AI infra, MLOps, API companies is where we are seeing some decline. What we have also seen is a lot of these AI infra companies, just by the nature of what problem they are trying to solve, they are much aware about AI documentation and all, and hence they are adopting much faster. In fact, almost 10 to 12 of our customers have already created their MCP doc servers, and they are going pretty heavy on this side. I think everybody has, basic things like skills or agents.md already on their documentation for easy navigation, and agent should be able to discover them quickly. So I think they are doing it. One thing which I feel should happen, and specifically on closed source companies, whose code snippets are not widely available, is they should start adding more and more code on their documentation. Because see, all the open source, obviously everything is available on GitHub, and agents are able to understand that. Old DevTool companies, yes, their code is available on Stack Overflow, Reddit, and all those places, so agents are still able to pick up. But new companies and where there are not a lot of these executables or these code snippets is where the problem is happening. So I think I have seen a few companies have started doing it, but not a lot. But I'm assuming in the next 6 months, things are going to change.
Got it. And what are the companies that have sort of enabled MCP in their docs and, are using MCP intent gateway? What change are they seeing in terms of the kind of intent they're getting, in terms of conversions that they might be getting? Is there any data there?
This is fascinating. In fact, one of our customer, there was a big bank in Australia, and they were just trying to figure out how to reach out to them. And I think just after like 15 to 20 days of integrating with their MCP docs, they started understanding exactly the problem they are trying to solve. So they were writing, in plain English that this is what I am trying to do, why this is not working, this is my use case, whatever that tool was can help me in this. So the moment they knew it, the outreach was so contextualized that in the next 7 days, they were able to book the meeting, and in the next 1.5 months, they were able to close it. So I think the results are fascinating. I mean, it's happening at a, more than expected rate, actually.
Interesting. I think the kind of intent that you get when you're able to understand what is it that they're trying to do, I think that's unmatched. That's like a product demo that they're asking you for. So I think it's quite interesting. Yeah, so I think we've talked about, books to forums, Stack Overflow to documentation, and now from, browsing to actually asking. And maybe I think it's just not AI. It's also about where knowledge lives and who or what is consuming it. And I think as documentation is becoming something which is more queried and not read, and evaluation may involve agents as much as humans, DevTool teams need to rethink not just distribution, but how they're actually understanding who's interacting with it and why. And I think having that layer is something which is really important. So I'd love to close, with this one question to the both of you, and maybe we can start with you, Emil. What's one thing DevTool leaders should start doing today to get ready for what's happening and where this is headed?
If you have some sort of AI agent or assistant live in your product on your documentation side, if you've hosted an MCP server, look at the data. There's some really interesting intent here. One side, of course, from a marketing perspective, like trying to understand what your leads are, potentially asking if there's high intent folks. But increasingly, I would argue from a product direction and roadmap perspective, you will see a stark difference in how users and traditional human developers are asking questions to AI, chat, and then actually seeing how agents are using it. It's surprisingly different, and it's very, very interesting.
Interesting. Gaurav, your take on the same.
I was going to say the same two things which Emil said. Double down on agent experience. If you're not doing it today, you are already out of the. And second, I feel is MCPifying the docs. Make sure you are looking at those questions both from product as well as from a GTM perspective. Understand your users well and try to see, how you can make more and more users install your MCP servers in their IDs or wherever cloud, whatever they are using. Yeah, I think those two things.
Makes sense. I think both of you are aligned on where this is headed and what the DevTool teams should do. But thank you so much. I think this was a very thoughtful discussion, and while the shift may be quiet, I think the implications are significant, and it'll be very fascinating to see how DevTool teams respond here. So thank you so much for your time and this discussion.
Thank you.